My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division at the National Library of Medicine here at the National Institutes of Health. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our 2022 series of all virtual NLM history talks. And for those of you on Twitter, thanks very much for following along using the hashtag NLMHistTalk. NLM history talks promote awareness and use of NLM and related historical collections for research, education, and public service in the fields of biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the NLM to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. Our series is also intended to foreground the voices of people of color, women, and individuals of a variety of cultural and disciplinary backgrounds who value these collections and use them to advance their research, their teaching, and their learning. We supplement NLM History Talks with speaker interviews on our blog called Circulating Now, which is located at circulatingnow.nlm.nih.gov. I'll add that NLM History Talks are made possible by an outstanding team here at the National Library of Medicine and at NIH Videocasting, and I want to thank each and every one of them for their time and their talent in bringing this program to you, the public. Before I introduce today's speaker, a few notes. I'd like to call your attention to our next NLM History Talk, the 6th Annual Michael E. DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. It's going to be offered by Dr. Matthew Stibbe, who is Professor of Modern European History at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. This talk, Dr. Stibbe's talk, will be held next Thursday, May 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. He'll be speaking on a laboratory of humanitarianism, military and civilian captivity during the First World War. I'd also like to call your attention, please, to the live feedback button under the video stream that you're watching. Please use this feature to send questions to me, which I'll then share with our speaker during our Q&A following today's talk. And most notably, today's talk is co-sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the National Library of Medicine National Endowment for the Humanities Partnership to collaborate on research, education, and career initiatives. Thanks indeed to the NEH and our colleagues there for their co-sponsorship and indeed our great partnership over the years. With all of this, I have the great pleasure now and privilege of introducing Dr. Rana Hogarth, Associate Professor of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Hogarth holds her doctorate in history from Yale University and her master's in health policy from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. At the University of Illinois, she teaches courses on race and revolutions, slavery and society, and race, science, and medicine, among other related subjects. Dr. Hogarth's research focuses on the medical and scientific constructions of race during the era of slavery and beyond. Dr. Hogarth was recently recognized by her institution as a Helen Corley Pitt Scholar for outstanding education and research conveyed through her energy, her creativity, and potential in teaching and advancing research at the University of Illinois College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Dr. Hogarth's first book, Medicalizing Blackness, Making Racial Difference in the Atlantic World, 1780 to 1840, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2017. In it, she examines how white physicians medicalize blackness, a term she uses to describe the process by which white physicians define blackness as a medically significant marker of difference in slave societies of the American Atlantic. In addition to her book, Dr. Hogarth is author of numerous articles in journals, including the American Journal of Public Health, History Compass, and African and Black Diaspora. Her next project, about which she's going to be speaking today, examines the genealogy and deployment of the terms used to describe mixed race offspring of Black and white people, mulatto, quadroon, etc., in American medical and lay discourse. Dr. Hogarth's work traces how these terms were used in colonial Caribbean contexts and in mainland North America during the era of slavery, and illuminates how American eugenicists adopted these terms to correlate mental and physical capabilities of mixed race people to their racial ancestral makeup. I'm honored today to welcome Dr. Hogarth to the National Library of Medicine to speak on the measure of Black unfitness, legacies of slavery in the early eugenics movement. Dr. Hogarth, welcome, and thank you so much for your time today. We really look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled to be sharing some of my work with you today. I am very much looking also forward to the Q&A. So I am going to be sharing with you kind of new work, some preliminary findings, if you will. And so part of my talk today is coming from my second book project, which is tentatively titled Measuring Miscegenation, Eugenic Race Crossing Studies and the Legacies of Slavery. Now, I do want to offer just a quick content warning for the audience. I will be using terms such as Negro, racial hybrid, miscegenation, mulatto, and quadroon, but I only use those terms to stay in keeping with the historical context and the language of my historical actors. So my use of these terms is in no way an endorsement. So with this new project that I'm going to share with you today, I set out to answer several historical questions that were related to the construction of race and racial difference in the aftermath of slavery. And many of these questions did in fact emerge when I was completing the first book. So for example, I noticed that in some of the primary sources, the medical texts that I would read, I would see that there were references to mixed race people having different susceptibilities than Black people for certain kinds of fevers and diseases. And it got me thinking about how each racial components of a mixed race person, and this is specifically people with Black and white ancestry, how that was actually being viewed by physicians and viewed in medical and scientific discourse. So I started to consider how the racial makeup of a mixed race person was measured and wondered when that kind of process began in earnest. I wanted to understand the scientific logic behind it. I wanted to know what slavery had to do with it, if anything at all. And this actually led me down the path of pursuing questions about precision methods to quantify Blackness that were especially employed by eugenicists, particularly Charles B. Davenport, who was actually one of America's leading eugenicists in the early 20th century. So essentially, I started this project saying, okay, I'm just going to look at a couple of Davenport's race crossing studies of so-called Black and white racial hybrids. And I wanted to understand what ideas about race undergirded his studies and sort of guided his research trajectory. So I guess you could say that this current project examines the process through which eugenicists came to measure mixed race people, those of Black and white ancestry, and classify them as physically, mentally, and socially unfit. And as with my first book, Medicalizing Blackness, which looked at race making in the United States and the Anglophone Caribbean, I also use these same regions in this current project. In fact, I find that in doing this study and in starting this project, slavery era ideas from these regions, as they related to racial fitness, endurance, intelligence, and ability, actually laid the ideological groundwork for a lot of these eugenic race crossing studies on mulattoes in the early decades of the 20th century. So essentially, these former slave societies in the Americas emerge as critical staging grounds for eugenicists, social scientists, anthropologists, and others in allied professions to extract data from these so-called Black and white racial hybrids for the purposes of advancing knowledge about the science of heredity and racial fitness more broadly. And so essentially the science that this research supported validated the kind of belief that race was an aspect of one's biology, that Black people's status was biologically determined and a function of their race. And one thing that I found in looking again at this region is that, of course, the measure of miscegenation and racial fitness was indeed a transnational enterprise. So Charles Davenport, who I'll say a little bit more about in a moment, actually conducted two of his major race crossing studies, the heredity of skin color and Negro white crosses in 1913, and race crossing in Jamaica in 1929 in the British West Indies. So, despite his claims that there were high rates of illegitimacy, which of course fell in line with very pervasive and rampant and erroneous ideas about Black sexuality, Davenport claims that despite all this illegitimacy, he was able to get the data that he needed. There was no language barrier for his research assistants. There was no concern about outing family secrets and sort of that could lead to severe harm for the research subject. So if we think about what's going on in the redeemed South in the United States, thinking about the nadir of race relations, people would have been very reticent to speak about certain aspects of their family, their ancestry. So he found that he could get around that in the Caribbean. But I think also something that's quite critical to thinking about where he conducts his studies is that Davenport was able to construct parts of the Caribbean as sort of these backwards places where racial mixture was allowed to take place and kind of other and pathologize that geography in a way that wouldn't offend his American audiences, considering that the kinds of topics that he was addressing involved interracial sex. And in many cases, this would have involved white men and enslaved Black women, like generations of mixed race people. And this was really not a topic that he could address openly the way that he may have wanted to in the United States. So essentially, to deal with this taboo subject of interracial sex and mixing, Davenport decided that he would focus on the Caribbean, he could openly talk about it there, and he would just cast that place as immoral and sort of a sign of a lesser civilized part of the world. A lot of this, of course, kind of points to slavery, the role of slavery in creating the circumstances that aided racial mixing. And I think is sort of essential to thinking about the creation or the conducting of these studies of mixed race people. So one thing to think about, again, like making a parallel between slavery and eugenics, is that this ability to compare the bodies of Black and white people in sickness and health very much took place during the era of slavery. And a lot of the data that was collected sort of resurfaces. It doesn't just sort of dissipate. And so what I wanted to do with this project was to think about and sort of center slavery in this respect, but kind of show how eugenic efforts at quantifying racial mixture and assessing racial fitness actually represented a marriage of new ideas in terms of Mendelian genetics and sort of old ideas that holdovers from slavery. So it's a sort of marriage of these two approaches. And I also wanted to just say a little bit about what I hope to do with the second project. So one, I really want to reframe eugenics and the targets of the eugenic gaze. So there are a lot of studies on eugenics that will tell us about sort of, it's clearly anti-Semitic, ableist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant sort of reactions, right? If we think about the early 20th century and the changing demographic landscapes. But I also thought, we could also consider the roles of people of African descent in the Americas and what their experiences were like with eugenics. I also wanted to move a little bit away from the approach to thinking about, the inappropriate application of Mendelian genetics to people and focus more on measurement, anthropometry, anthropology, and other disciplines that were not as sort of new and now, as one might say, in that time period, but actually had roots in slavery and the Civil War era. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. As I said, with this project, I want to think about the blending of new technologies with the logic of racial categorization rooted in slavery. So for example, Davenport might take pictures of mixed race people and say, okay, well, this person is a quadroon, this is an octoroon, and this person is a mulatto. And somehow the eye is supposed to know exactly what he's talking about. But of course, he is accessing and using a kind of racial categorization that we find during the era of slavery. And so he's sort of telling us, okay, these are the features to look for, as if to sort of further categorize and isolate these individuals. And then, of course, as I mentioned before with this project, I really want us to think about the role of former slave societies in the Americas as these critical sites for eugenicists to measure racial fitness and to sort of, again, kind of extract data from these mixed race people. Now, I do want to focus today, and what I will mostly focus on today is point one, sort of this idea of reframing eugenics and the targets of the eugenic gaze. So essentially, as I said before, there's this use of comparative anatomy, anthropometry, anthropology, along with Mendelian genetics and new developments in statistical analysis that creates what I would argue is a facade of precision data collection on mixed race people. And we can think about, for example, point two, when I mentioned anthropometry in the Civil War, we can think about data that was collected by the US Sanitary Commission during the Civil War, particularly data on vitality and lung capacity of Black, white, and mixed race troops. And that data actually suggested that Black people and mulattoes were less fit than whites. And this is the kind of data that men like Davenport will refer to. So we can think about really excellent scholarship by Lundy Braun, for example, who has discussed the spirometer, certainly something used in the Sanitary Commission study that basically offers us, proof of how this approach to precision measurement of vitality amongst different races essentially contributed and helped to create this fiction of innate racial difference. So in a sense, I really want to consider the long shadow slavery cast over the development of eugenics, and how it has sort of very major repercussions, for the ways that we think about how Black people experience eugenics as objects of interest before they became targets of later 20th century eugenic practices, such as involuntary sterilization. So I do want to make a very specific claim here that I am focusing on the early decades of the 20th century, not so much going into mid-century and into like the 70s, where we have very clear cases of involuntary sterilization of Black and brown women. I'm focusing again mostly on this sort of early period. But I do want to say that when we think about eugenics in this early period, it's seldom viewed through the lens of the anti-Black racism that continued to fester and grow after the Civil War. And I want us to sort of think about this because in this way, it can be transformative for how we think about histories of slavery and histories of science. I kind of want to push back against the idea that eugenics is purely sort of reactionary. So changes in the demographic landscape, changes in immigration, these are the things that cause eugenics to sort of emerge. I actually want to think about this more as part of an ongoing practice of race making, an ongoing practice of pathologizing certain bodies that had already been going on. Now, I do want to be clear that new advances in genetics, of course, influenced men like Davenport, of course, influenced the quest to measure and predict certain human traits. But I think that this is one part of the story. I think we do need to kind of look back to the era of slavery. I would say that we cannot disaggregate the nature of eugenic studies of mulattoes from the slavery era ideologies that aided in the construction of that very group of people. So I think about this in the sense of, and I'm just going to say rather explicitly, I want to name eugenics as a scientific discipline that was a direct beneficiary of slavery era ideologies about race and fitness. And I do think that, again, in terms of where this fits with other studies that are out there, I often find that when people talk about eugenics, as I said before, it's often viewed as this movement that targeted, and I'm quoting here, quote, not racial outsiders, but marginalized insiders who threatened national and class ideals, end quote. Now, this is certainly true. And again, I'm sure many in the audience who are familiar with eugenics might think of Indiana and think of the first involuntary sterilization laws and think about the fact that this is targeting white inmates or prisoners, poor white people. All of this is, of course, very true. But what I want to do is kind of expand this idea and modify it a bit by recognizing that mixed race people with Black ancestry were racial outsiders and marginalized insiders. They were present in the Americas as part of nation and empire building, but they were always marginalized and excluded. And I think if we take this very expansive view, we can also consider the experiences of other non-white people who were born in the United States for generations, who were marginalized insiders and racial outsiders, such as Japanese Americans, for example. So we might consider also, in terms of being very elastic here with the idea of reframing eugenics, we might consider how anxieties about racial purity and fitness as they related to non-white people had a very storied history before the 20th century, even before Francis Galton's formal coining of the term eugenics in 1883. So, of course, in thinking about eugenics, you think about a lot of the great secondary literature out there. And of course, I picked up Daniel Kevlis's work, who's one of the leading authorities on eugenics. And he points out that roughly 20 years before even coining the term eugenics, Galton had already set about writing about ways to improve human stock. Galton did not hesitate, for example, to pronounce Black people as mentally inept. And these thoughts appear in his 1869 Hereditary Genius. And this is where, Kevlis notes, Galton wanted to investigate, quote, the origins of natural ability, end quote. And if we dig deeper into Hereditary Genius, we find that Galton theorized that Negro intelligence was on average 2 grades below that of the English and was not a sign of, quote, good stock. So this assessment also is revealing because Galton tells us where he's getting some of this data. He says, quote, the number among the Negroes of those whom we shall call half-witted men is very large. Every book alluding to Negro servants in America is full of instances, end quote. So he's clearly accessing a space of sort of racial geography. He's looking at the Americas. This is in 1869. He's mentioning this idea of Negro servants. I think in many ways, this gives us an example of sort of where Galton is thinking, and he's certainly thinking along racialized lines here. But where is he getting his data? From the Americas, from a place that has obviously been changed by sort of the slave system, right? That has sort of shaped the contours of the American landscape. So in thinking about this, pushing back, right? So not starting with 1883 with the coining of that term like a formulae, but actually thinking about early ideas of good stock and sort of mental abilities and which racial groups were sort of in and out of that categorization. The other thing that I do when I say I'm reframing eugenics and the targets of the eugenic gaze, again, goes back to anthropometry. And this is, again, you'll see here, I've just underlined, this is also 1869, so going back a bit earlier and thinking about anthropometry, which is sort of the science that defines physical measures of a person's size, form, and functional capacities. Physicians and scientists who are working for the U.S. Sanitary Commission study Black, white, mulatto soldiers, right? And here is investigations of the military and anthropological statistics of American soldiers. This is published in 1869, and it's pictured right here. And here, of course, this is an effort that is led by Benjamin A. Gould. He's an actuary. He eventually becomes an astronomer. This is, again, a union effort. So these are for the folks who are fighting against slavery, but still very much wedded to the idea that there are innate biological differences between Black and white people, that Black people are inferior in some way to whites. And what Gould does is basically advocates for the measurement of men, to create and collect data, sort of hard facts, if you will. Of course, not recognizing that for many of the Black and mixed race troops that would have joined, probably have suffered from exposure or poor nutrition for a large portion of their life, since many were fleeing directly from slavery and were subject to poor living conditions. But at any rate, we have this so-called collection of hard data. And what's interesting is to find that American eugenicists like Charles Davenport actually cites Gould's study in his military study, Army Anthropology, which he co-authors with military physician Albert G. Love in 1919. So when Davenport is looking for the average weights of so-called mulattoes, he cites Gould, looking for their heights, looking for that kind of data. He's going back to this particular study. We also know that German statistician Frederick L. Hoffman, who authored Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro in 1896, also relied on Gould's data. And of course, we know Hoffman famously argued for the eventual extinction of Black people, including mulattoes. Hoffman writes, quote, "The inferior vitality of the mixed race is therefore sufficiently proven by both methods," end quote. This is sort of a reference to him citing Gould to say, oh, look, here's the data on their vitality. It's already been proven. It's already a fact. I just kind of want to bring this up to kind of give you a sense of, one, this early idea of fitness and racial fitness in the 1860s, thinking about how it's being used and kind of creating this paper trail for you. And I do want to say that a number of other fantastic scholars have also looked at this Sanitary Commission report. Margaret Humphreys, Leslie Schwam, James Downs, Paul Laurie, they've all kind of said, okay, this study actually is sort of like this clearinghouse of data about innate racial differences and measurement. And we can actually see more of this if we look into Davenport's paper. So this is from the American Philosophical Society, where I went to collect primary source data. You'll see these sort of references. This is a proposal for Negro study. This is in 1927. And sort of the question is, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we create and start planning this big study we want to enact? And you'll see here, when they're talking about the resume of previous work, there's a reference during the Civil War, observations on all of the races represented in the Northern Army were made and afterwards reported on. So you can see that there is sort of, I'm following this kind of paper trail to see who's citing who, where's this data coming from? And this is, again, informing the work of eugenicists like Charles Davenport so many years going forward. So the aim with this paper and the broader book is really to think about how we could fill gaps in our collective knowledge about Black people's experiences with eugenics in the early decades of the 20th century. And I want to think about how some of the assumptions, mythologies, lore, all of these things that are, of course, not true about mixed race people's bodies were actually picked up by eugenicists and like studied, right? They decided to look into this to see if it's actually correct, to either debunk myths or to modify things a bit. And there really is like no shortage of white commentators, physicians, scientists, et cetera, who were interested in kind of picking up these threads of information and kind of running with them. So for example, I'm going to focus quite a bit on Charles Davenport, but I want to be really clear. I started the project and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to end up working with Davenport's papers. But of course, Davenport joined a pretty crowded field of scientists who are interested in this topic. So we can think, for example, of white and Black scientists who are studying people of African descent. We have Melville Hertzkowitz, we have Franz Boas, we have Du Bois, we have Carl Pearson, and of course, Carolyn Bondé. So I should say, and I'll say a little bit more about Carolyn Bondé, she actually was a mixed race woman herself. She trained under Ernest Houghton. She earned a master's in anthropology at Harvard, and she conducted her own study on mixed race people, and she had very different conclusions from Charles Davenport. So I do focus on Davenport quite a bit just because, his research methods were critiqued by his peers. They may have agreed with his views on race, but they didn't care for his scientific methodologies. So for example, I just could not resist, but Carl Pearson, who was at one point in time a friend of Davenport, wrote a scathing review of race crossing in Jamaica. And it was basically, it had nothing to do with Davenport and espousing racist views. It was about his science. So Carl Pearson actually says of Davenport, he says, quote, "The only thing that is apparent in this whole work of this lengthy treatise, this is race crossing in Jamaica, is that the samples are too small and drawn from too heterogeneous a population to provide any trustworthy conclusions at all," end quote. So this is sort of what his peers are thinking. Meanwhile, Carolyn Bondé, she is trained using sort of similar methods of measurement. And she writes her master's thesis in 1932, a study of some Negro white families in the United States. And again, she kind of does this under the aegis of showing the great accomplishments of mixed race people, very much opposite to what Davenport has to say. And I will say that her work has not been as thoroughly studied as Davenport's, but I do know that there are a number of scholars who are looking at how Black people responded to and in some ways participated in eugenics. And some of these scholars include Aya Nuruddin, Michelle Mitchell, just to name a few, but there is clearly a scholarship, a body of scholarship out there that suggests that Black people are not passive. They are also interested in racial uplift and interested in ideas of eugenics. So really what I want to do is what I find myself doing with this project now is kind of using Davenport as this like point of entry and sort of thinking about who else is tackling these questions and how is slavery informing that. So now I want to just share with you a little bit of some of the myth making and ideas about Black unfitness and mixed race unfitness that Davenport tackles and that other sort of scientists at this time are thinking about when they're looking at mixed race people and conducting these studies. So some of the claims about mixed race people that Davenport addresses in his work include claims that mixed race people were inherently sickly and that they were unable to reproduce. So we can think about how these myths circulated. They circulated widely in the Americas, actually well before the advent of eugenics. They weren't always consistent. We can think about the ways in which physicians would sort of make complaints about the inability of mixed race people to do one thing, but then claim that they were superior at doing other things. So a good example comes from a pro-slavery physician, and this is them claiming that mulattoes are just inherently weak. So the editor of the Memphis Medical Recorder, A.P. Merrill, in 1855, complained that the mulatto was, quote, less curable than white persons on account of his greater feebleness of constitution, end quote. Other views around this time period were kind of similar. We can think about slave owners from the British Caribbean. In 1834, Matthew Gregory Lewis casually complained that mulattoes were, quote, almost universally weak and effeminate persons, end quote. And of course, as I mentioned before, Benjamin Gould, sort of the U.S. Sanitary Commission's report, actually says that it was a well-known phenomenon that mixed race men had, quote, inferior vitality. So here are some of these ideas that the mixed race people are just innately weak. Now, Davenport, of course, is aware of this. So thinking about flashing forward to the 20th century, Davenport is aware of this. And he actually earnestly addressed the hardiness, the robustness of mixed race people in incidental asides in his studies, right? He made reference to it. But I would say that even just mentioning this topic to begin with is participating in a long project of assessing and critiquing and commenting on African descended people's bodily capacities, which is something that was a project of slavery, right? So for example, Davenport, when he talks about the robustness of mixed race people, he will reference slavery era commenters. So I want to give you an example of this. Two very well-known slavery era commenters are kind of known for propagating this idea that mixed race people cannot reproduce. So the first is Edward Long, who's an 18th century planter. And he wrote that it was, quote, extraordinary that two mulattoes should be unable to continue their species, the women either proving barren or their offspring, if they have any, not attaining maturity. The subject deserves further and very attentive inquiry, end quote. So that's 1774. That's Edward Long, who's propagating this claim that mixed race people cannot reproduce. So yeah, further and attentive inquiry it certainly received. In 1843, Josiah Nott, a pro-slavery physician from the United States, absolutely decided to devote time to this topic. And so in his 1843 article, The Mulatto, a Hybrid, Possible Extermination of the Two Races if Whites and Blacks are Allowed to Intermarry, clearly makes reference to this idea of inability to reproduce. But what's interesting is that Nott names Eastwick and Edward Long in his discussion. So he says that they're high authorities in their histories of Jamaica, and they both assert unhesitatingly, quote, that the male and female mulatto do not produce so many children together, end quote. Nott also says they have, quote, shorter lifespans than either whites or blacks, and the women are plagued by physiological delicacy and an inability to bear children or to conceive children, end quote. So this is Josiah Nott and Edward Long during the era of slavery, making these obviously false claims about the ability of mixed race people to reproduce. What's interesting is that Davenport handles this. He totally brings it up. And what he does in his study, The Heredity of Skin Color in Negro White Crosses in 1913, he basically says there is an ancient tradition that mulattoes are unprolific. This is affirmed by Long, 1774, and then he mentions Nott. So he's quite literally, by name, pointing out these figures who claim that mixed race people cannot reproduce. Davenport concludes, quote, there's no support in our data for the notion of a lack of fecundity of Negro white crosses, nor their deficient viability, end quote. So he's sort of saying, this is not true. This is the myth that needs to be debunked. But I want to be very clear here. Davenport is not progressive. He wants to say that science is what we should rely on when we make any kind of statement. So while he doesn't believe in this idea of an inability to reproduce, and he's less willing to say that mixed race people are inherently weak, he does kind of make claims about the weakness of their constitution in a very indirect way. So for example, he will say that mixed race people inherit some physical robustness from Black people. He says, the Negro has many advantages in physical quality over the white. He's less apt to suffer from defects of the spine, goiter, obesity, deaf mutism, deafness. The mulatto show much of these excellent physical qualities of the Negro, end quote. But before we say, okay, well, Davenport seems reasonable, trust me, he's not. He then goes on to say that mulattoes showed extraordinarily high rates of tuberculosis and venereal disease rates that are several times higher than among the whites. This is an old idea, particularly the case of venereal diseases, of this being something that is endemic to Black populations. And so rather than saying, okay, they're weak, I think he's actually painting them as vectors of disease, that they are a public health menace. And I want to be clear, even though we can say, well, by the 20th century, we understand germ theory, that TB, it's an infection, it's contagious, there is still a very clear kind of assumption that there are certain races that are more prone to tuberculosis. So we can think specifically of the ways in which Mexicans were treated in the Southwest as being a race that was particularly prone to tuberculosis. And the reason for that was because they had too much indigenous blood and were too far removed from civilization, which made them more susceptible to getting tuberculosis. So here Davenport is kind of doing something similar by collapsing a susceptibility to an infectious disease to something that is a part of a racial deficiency. So this is a sort of scrutinizing of the mythologies about mixed race people's robustness, their hardiness. And as I said, Davenport will debunk some of these myths, but he kind of replaces them, I think, with very much pernicious ideas about mixed race people being potential public health burdens and menaces. So there's also, of course, attention to mixed race people's features. which again, we can look to the 18th century and find this obsession with features of mixed race people. Again, we can think about Edward Long, who is the 18th century planter, who provided this very detailed view of mulatto features where he says, quote, "They seem to partake more of the white than the black. The hair has a natural curl. In some it resembles the Negro fleece, but in general it is of tolerable length," end quote. Now, you may think, okay, well, that's just trivial. That's Edward Long being sort of strange and sort of obsessive. But the reality is that Davenport diligently studied mixed race people's hair. In fact, at the APS, and looking through the Eugenic Record Office papers, which are housed there, the Eugenic Records Office was started by Davenport in 1910. We actually have their family pedigrees. There are people bringing in specimens and sharing information about their family with that office. I located hair samples. These are so-called mulatto hair samples. This is from the McDonough family, which was a mulatto family that resided in Jamaica in the parish of St. Anne. I'm still trying to understand if they volunteered to send their hair specimens to the ERO. So they sent it to the office, this is in New York. So I'm wondering about sort of the story behind how these samples got into the ERO, got into Davenport's hands. But I should say that in the Heredity of Skin Color and Negro White Crosses, there's a whole section dedicated to mulatto hair. So Davenport really draws attention to what he sees as sort of typical features. So he wanted to know, quote, "In how far is the absence or presence of Negro skin pigment associated with the absence or presence of other Negro characteristics?" There are two traits that are associated with dark pigmentation of the skin of the Negro, of which we can trace association of the offspring of hybrids, namely color of the hair and form of the hair or degree of curving. So while he says that the association is accidental, the idea of black skin color and so-called, quote, woolly hair, he does keep referring to kinky or woolly hair as a typical Negro trait, and he applies that term throughout his research. So you can see here, for example, he lists an octoroon daughter who has curly but not at all kinky hair. By a white man had a son. Like, you'll see that he's just accessing and using these terminologies to describe these different kind of populations, these different kind of racial crosses. At the bottom, he notes a son with a swarthy complexion, a deeply tanned skin with much yellow, dark brown eyes, and black hair, which shows a trace of a tendency to curl. It's almost as if it's sort of like, these are the traits that could give away who has African ancestry, who may not appear to be, right, who might be very light-skinned, who might try to pass, for example. So he's looking at features, but he's also looking at intelligence. So I should say that there was, during the era of slavery, a view that mixed race people were of intermediate intelligence. So if you think about a racial hierarchy, having whites at the tops, mixed race people in the middle, and then black people at the bottom. So this is sort of a very common belief in slave societies. And what Davenport wants to do is really interrogate this idea, are mixed race people more intelligent? Are they really in sort of the middle? And what he does is he actually disagrees with this idea, but it's actually kind of interesting how he does so. So first, let me just give you an example of what I mean by this slavery era lore about intermediate intelligence. If we look at an 1852 publication on agriculture and industry in the South, we find the anonymous writer noting, quote, "It appears at all events certain that the mixed race exhibits powers more susceptible to cultivation than the pure African. Every day's observation shows that the mulatto is endowed with mental gifts superior to his black brother," end quote. Now, I should say that's in the Southern United States. We also have data from the Caribbean. So if we think about the ways in which planters and estate managers would actually entrust, quote, enslaved mulattoes with positions that required skill and intelligence because they would be of no use or no benefit to the plantation economy in any other capacity, end quote. So there's this idea that mixed race people are more intelligent and can do more skilled and intense work. Davenport is not having any of this. He was completely unconvinced that mixed race people had any kind of edge in intelligence. So if we look at race crossing in Jamaica, he does in fact concede that, okay, mixed race people seem to score a little bit higher on their intelligence test than black people. But he says that they had too much variation. What he says, And here I just want to give you a sense that when he's doing his notes, these are again from the APS, his notes on race crossing in Jamaica, you'll see that he has nasal breath. He looks at the color of the person. He looks at the hair form. He says, is this person full black? What are the nose, eyes, lip shape? Then he will see at the bottom is that where that box is, Knox Moron test. Summary of means in Army Alpha test. Those are the intelligence tests that he used in race crossing in Jamaica to assess the intelligence of mixed race people. So these are just his sort of the notes, and then he would have these different figures in the published study. So as he's sort of trying to take aim at this idea of innate, of intermediate intelligence, he basically claims that this wide variation is a problem because of race crossing. He writes, quote, whites scored higher than the blacks while the browns secured an intermediate score. But a study of the distribution showed that in many cases that about 5% of the browns received lower scores than any of the blacks or whites. The results is not due merely to the chance inclusion among the browns of some individuals of unusually low intelligence. Rather, among the various brown are some individuals who find themselves quite unable to even make a start on certain mental tests. There are fewer full-blooded blacks who show such complete incapacity. It seems reasonable to ascribe this idiosyncrasy of the browns to their hybrid nature, end quote. So he's literally saying it is because they are of mixed race, there's disharmony in this cross. And in fact, he basically goes on to say that, you know, is there, he asked the question and he answers this quite, you know, clearly. He says, is there any ground for the alleged inferiority of browns to blacks? And his response is quite predictable. He says, quote, it is frequently stated that hybrids are inferior to either parental stock, that they inherit the worst traits of both. The brown is contrasted unfavorably with the black, who though he may be stupid and lazy, can at least be depended upon to react in his own way, end quote. So it's almost like he's saying, oh, this group, we already had these very low expectations of them, but the browns are so, they're just all over the place. And this is a sign of why this hybrid group is a problem. So again, this is all, much of this is in Race Crossing in Jamaica. This is the published study. And what we see here is that he is very much, as I said, skeptical of this idea of mulatto intelligence. And I will say that other American scientists, sociologists, actually believed in the idea of mulatto intelligence. So Davenport, again, is kind of standing alone here. So we could think about, for example, the American agriculturist and strong advocate of compulsory sterilization, Paul Popenoe, who in his 1918 eugenics texts basically said that the high scholarly attainment of mulatto children in comparison to their black counterparts confirms the belief of many observers that the ability of a colored man is proportionate to the amount of white blood he has, end quote. So you have sort of different views of this. All of these are, of course, decidedly anti-Black and very much steeped in anti-Black racism. But you see here, on one hand, Davenport saying, no, that they're not more intelligent. You see another commenter saying, no, they are more intelligent because they have white blood in them. Okay, so I want to sort of move ahead because there is so much to tell you, but I want to I just want to kind of conclude here. Because what I'm trying to show you, and I'm trying to paint a picture here for you, of the ways in which ideas that were lingering in slavery kind of show up and inform these attempts to understand mixed race people's bodies, whether it be their features, their vitality, and then their intelligence. So to conclude, many of the constellations of ideas about what constituted Blackness as a mark of one's biology was basically developed in medical polities during the era of slavery. They continued to flourish after the institution's demise. And these ideas showed remarkable endurance, and many of them evolved. But in either case, they became the scaffolding for building eugenic logic about racial mixture, purity, and fitness. These ideas endured, but they also represented part of this ethos of identifying specific characteristics in groups of people and then comparing them to other groups for the purposes of understanding weakness and strength. And this, I would argue, is a shared feature of eugenics and slavery. So we have this idea of slavery being premised on the notion of inherent soundness and fitness of Black people's body to labor. Those assumptions, of course, changed when slavery ended. And when the reality of racial mixture that had gone on for centuries came out as this open secret, it became deemed a public health problem. So what we see here is that eugenics was invested in making legible the strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of bodies via their inherited traits. And one of the many lasting consequences of slavery then was rendering Blackness as a legible physiological and phenotypic trait. Davenport and others of his ilk, no doubt, seized upon this logic. His race-crossing studies shared with the slavery-era discourse a desire to pathologize Black people's bodies by harping on their imagined physical peculiarities, and we can think of his pathologization of the mulatto body as a very predictable corollary. So I wanted to just say that when we think about what comes out of race-crossing in Jamaica, he notes the fear of these pass for whites. So these are people that could weave through and move through the color line and possibly taint the white race. So Davenport refined and repackaged white supremacist ideas about the inferiority of Black people by focusing on the allegedly disharmonious results that occurred when Black and white people reproduced together. He may have corrected some of the misperceptions about mixed race people, but that was not out of a desire to right past wrongs. Davenport actually transformed the image of the mulatto in the era of slavery from a benign and barren accident of nature to a dangerous, mentally inferior hybrid at the dawn of the 20th century. He rendered them a class of people that could stealthily corrupt the fiction of white racial purity and drag down the white race with unfavorable, heritable Black traits. Thank you.
Dr. Hogarth, thank you very much. Fantastic talk. We have a couple of questions that have come in. And the first one is, can you characterize the transmission of enduring or changing ideas of eugenics in the professional literature? And how accessible have you found that historical professional literature to be?
So, and sorry, can you just repeat that? I wanted to try and write down the question.
Sure.
So
Can you characterize the transmission of enduring or changing ideas of eugenics in professional literature, and how accessible has that historical professional literature been to you?
Okay, so yes, certainly, you can find these transmissions in sort of the literature. So what I've been doing, and I should kind of lay this out. I have been looking through publications about race and about fitness, specifically looking at this period from 1900 to 1910s. And what I've been finding is, I will find a reference, right? For example, I'll see like Gould or Baxter. I'm like, okay, what is this? I write it down, I go and look this up, and I find that these are those Army anthropology studies, right? Those anthropometry studies. And so I'm like, okay, what are they studying? And I see that they're making references to innate racial differences. So I start to think about, okay, this is somebody in 1915 citing this 1869 study. So what I've been doing is I'm actually trying to compile and amass sort of a kind of paper trail and kind of connect the dots backwards. So it's like I started at first just reading these eugenic, these treatises, right? You read Paul Popenoe, you read Davenport, you may read Alice Herdlicka, all of these kinds of claims about innate difference in so-called inferior races. And I just really wanted to understand, okay, what made them inferior? Who inspired this kind of view, right? It didn't just fall out of the sky. And yes, of course, I understand that immigration is something that is driving this. But what I did, even with the first book, was to kind of really understand the paper trail and the culture of citation and the idea of relying on the sense of this is objective. I am following in the footsteps of other elite trained men, they're mostly men, who are coming up with this data. So it's very easy for me actually to start with some of these published treatises and articles, see what their footnotes are, go back and see, okay, these are some of those published documents from earlier. But what's really been fascinating is to go into the archive and look at manuscripts where you can really see the messiness behind how they got to that published thing. So, race crossing in Jamaica is, one can access this. The military studies, one can access this like digitally and you can read them. But what's interesting is that you can look at a questionnaire that was offered to military physicians during the Civil War, where they would have something called a Negro questionnaire. That is a manuscript source that's held elsewhere. So those are the things that I'm following up on. So certainly you can see this sort of transmission of this enduring knowledge, and it's very much there and front and center in the publications. What I want to do is understand the messiness and the process behind this and some of the unpublished work. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Someone else has written in, not a question, but an observation with thanks. I was taught in the 8th grade in the 1980s, this person specifies that biracial people could not reproduce, exclamation point. I informed the teacher that my grandmother was biracial and clearly had my mother. Rolling eyes emoji. Thank you for your work. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you for that comment. I appreciate your comment too, because you would think that this idea of would be nonsense, right? It obviously doesn't make sense considering what we know about the history of the Americas. But the fact that eugenicists are like, we should look into this and really are using this, oh, are they fecund or what could possibly be wrong with them, is something that I just couldn't ignore, let's say, when I started this research.
Understood. Thank you. This is what happens when questions come in very quickly. Pardon me. Thank you for this enlightening talk. This person writes in, Davenport died in 1944, just as institutions like the Army were on the cusp of desegregating, and as the nascent civil rights movement was getting started. The question is, did Davenport comment on these trends toward the end of his life? Did he try to influence policy or politics?
Oh, that's a really great question, actually. I mean, I confess, I don't know what he really spent his later part of his life in terms of his policy agenda. I do know that he actually measured Black children in Tuskegee, right, in the 30s and into the 40s. So Paul Lombardo has excellent work on this, I want to be very clear, Davenport did not see him as like a Madison Grant figure. Like, he did not see himself as this, firebrand, I'm just going to spew this kind of very clearly racist nonsense. Davenport truly saw himself as a scientist saying, okay, these people have some positive attributes to them and they can thrive in these kinds of circumstances, but they're not going to ever achieve more than that. So it's sort of, he had a very specific kind of racist approach that he was using that was undergirding his science. So I don't know, for example, if he would have been, he certainly was opposed to racial mixing and intermarriage, right? So, but I'm not sure how he would have come down on the idea of desegregation, right, in certain, but that's a really great question and something I'll think of.
Thank you. Another question, have you compared these eugenic ideas on white African American race mixing to anthropological ideas on white Native America miscegenation? Are there similarities or differences in the rhetoric and ideology? How do these ideas change over time?
Excellent question. I'm really happy about this question on several levels. So one, I've just started to dig my toes into understanding the various ways that these kinds of scientists approached race mixing. They did not have a uniform view. So I should say that Leslie Dunn did work of Native Hawaiians and mixes with people of Asian descent, and did not come to the same conclusions that Davenport did in terms of you should never have these kinds of races mixed. I will say that what Davenport did do, and I have this stack of papers from the APS, is he actually queried other scientists from around the world. Tell me about your racially mixed people, your hybrids. What are they like? So he has data from so-called crosses of Dutch and Javanese people. He has all sorts of very interesting ideas about, he's collected this data. So I sense that he is interested in this as a global phenomenon, because it was. With respect to the United States, and I think in other terms of other indigenous groups, there's certainly this idea that certain indigenous groups are viewed as sort of being primitive and could possibly be uplifted in some way. There's also the sense that they are kind of going to be extinct. So there's competing narratives about indigenous bodies. I will say something that I find to be quite fascinating is that if you look, and I think this is a work of Warwick Anderson's, where he looks at mixing of Aboriginals in Australia with white people, and there's the idea that you could breed the Aboriginal out of them. That does not happen in the United States. Nobody is advocating, oh, well, you can just breed the Black out of these mixed race people. So I know that there's a tension about how certain indigenous groups' bodies and mixtures with white are being viewed and talked about. So that is something that I am hoping to attend more to. But I want to just be very clear, it is not a uniform approach in terms of which racial groups are considered deficient and which one there's potential for and which one is considered just a hopeless public health menace. But thanks for this question. It's an excellent one.
Thank you. Another person who's written in, a great presentation. The Eugenics Records Office, as I understand it, relied heavily on field volunteers. Have you noticed yet any inconsistencies in their science, in quotes, of gathering data? I'm especially curious how this would apply to Black Americans and so-called mulattoes, in quotes.
Right. So this is really great. What I have are the notes, which I have to kind of go through. These are the handwritten notes from the field workers. So I have to go through and compare and see if they're all using kind of like uniform note taking, because I do know that when we look at race crossing in Jamaica and in the heredity of skin color of Negro white crosses, there are moments where Davenport will say, oh, this is an inconsistent reading, but that's due to errors of fieldwork. Oh, that's due to these kinds of subjectivities that happen. And so, for example, this is such an excellent question because not only is there going to be differences in terms of how the researchers are going and recording things, are they always being uniform or what they're seeing, but some of the tools that they use, the color top, which was initially marketed by Milton Bradley, but repurposed for the study of skin color, you just put these discs of color and you spin it next to a subject's upper arm, and then the researcher just has to eyeball it and say, okay, this percentage Black, this much red, white, and so there's so much subjectivity, right? And so one of the things that I am hoping to do when I go back to the APS is to kind of look at the ERO notes on like how the descriptions, the shorthand, the notations, and see, if there was uniformity across all of this raw data collection and see how that then got translated into the published work. But that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else has written in with this question. Could you say more about the involvement of the military in supporting eugenics research? What is the relationship between military, industry, science, and defense that would prompt the seemingly strange combination of Army anthropologist? Thank you very much for your presentation.
That is a great question. And so I think, happily, somebody has sort of done, I think, a little bit of this work. So Paul Laurie has looked at measurements, particularly focusing on the military measurement and sort of progressive era fears about labor and which bodies can work and which bodies are deficient at work. And so what you find is, I see this as kind of a bit opportunistic, right? So if you have this opportunity to say, we have these men, we can collect this data on them, and we can sort of start to kind of generalize and make sort of broad statements about what kind of work they're going to be able to do, how they're going to contribute to society, it kind of does make sense. So Paul Laurie actually looks at a lot of Army data on Black men, on mixed race men, to kind of, show that there is an anxiety about, okay, are they going to work? What kind of work will they do? Are they fit? Are they going to contribute to society? So there's a kind of, certainly an industrial, like progressive concern about having productive citizens, and particularly thinking about how are these people of this race, right, the so-called inferior race, how are they going to contribute to society? And so I see that these military studies make perfect sense. In fact, for Gould, at one point, if we look at the Sanitary Commission report and some of the unpublished data, there were medical officers who were like spying on the men as they were bathing naked to see if they could get as much information about form, because some of the men said, no, I do not want to be measured in this way. So they really were trying to take advantage of this opportunity to have a large N, right, of these different kinds of men, and then they could start to sort of average and tabulate for future use. And then of course there's a concern about defect, right? So part of what Davenport did, you think about World War I, is sort of, okay, what are the defects? What are the physical defects? What are the problems that we're noticing in some of these recruits? Is one racial group having more of these problems? So yeah, this served a whole variety of purposes. But yeah, that is a really great question. I would say Paul Laurie's work, I think, is quite good. That might offer more in-depth information.
Thank you. One final question before we conclude this afternoon with respect to your time. Thank you for this very interesting discussion. I have learned a lot more about eugenics. Do you think eugenics influenced how Black people viewed each other during slavery, house slave versus field slave, and colorism that continues to persist in Black populations today?
Great question. So I can speak more about colorism. So I don't know, to a lot of the data we have on field and how slaves are often given through white interlocutors. So you have to kind of read through that and see how much of that is true and how much of that is sort of being projected. But colorism Yes, it is real. So colorism continues to be a problem. It was a problem then, it's a problem now. And specifically, I did not mention this in the talk, but there is this idea of what features are considered to be positive features, or which people are meant to be the ones who will uplift the race. And in many cases, this does happen to be lighter skin or mixed race people in terms of having the opportunities or being sort of self-appointed race men, race women leaders, right? So much of what I do does tap into this. So specifically, Michelle Mitchell's work, A Righteous Propagation, talks specifically about some of the aspirations and concerns within African American communities about, who are going to be the leaders of the race, who are the people who are fit, who can sort of uplift everyone, and it very much falls along this kind of colorist line. And there are ways in which, in looking at iterations of like who can pass or what features are considered to be favorable, there is a line from Carolyn Bonday's research where she notes, the young girl's hair is frizzy, it's almost kinky, and she's very sensitive about it. And this is her interviewing, so Carolyn Bonday being a mixed race woman, she's also tapping into the fact that within the families that she is interviewing and talking to who do ask for anonymity, she's seeing even within families members saying, okay, I'm self-conscious that my hair isn't straight or it's kinkier or curlier than other members in my family. So you're absolutely right to mention this notion of colorism, which is most certainly present in all of these discourses, both for white eugenicists, but I would also argue for Black scientists who are interested in this issue of racial fitness.
Thank you. That's best. Well, Dr. Hogarth, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate you joining our series. We wish you every continued success in your work, and please keep in touch. And we look forward to doing so. Welcome you back at the library one day soon when we reopen. And all the best to you. Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been great fun. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.